Today, we are going to trace the epic story of Rome. It's a city born from a bloody legend, a city that grew into a republic, then transformed into the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, and then fell. This is a story of incredible and often violent change. You see, right at the very heart of Rome's identity is this idea of transformation. And it's a theme that starts not with history, but with a myth. A myth so powerful, it would define the Roman character for 1,000 years. So let's dive right in.
To really understand Rome, you have to start where the Romans themselves did, with a story of divine birth, savage survival, and a brutal murder at the very beginning of it all.
And what a legend it is. You have the twin sons of the god of war, Mars himself, Romulus and Remus, abandoned to die in a river. But they don't die. They're saved, famously nursed by a she-wolf, and then raised by a shepherd. When they grow up, they decide to found a city right there. But they argue about it, a fierce argument that ends when Remus mockingly jumps over the half-built walls his brothers started. For that, Romulus kills him on the spot.
With those words, Romulus carves the foundational principle of Rome into stone. The city, the state, its security, that is what matters most. It's worth more than family, more than brotherhood, more than any single human life. This founding murder, it's not just some old story, it's a mission statement. And you know, for centuries, this ideal held strong. Rome exploded from a tiny city-state into a sprawling republic that completely dominated the Mediterranean Sea. But the very success that made the republic so great also planted the seeds of its own destruction. So the question is, what finally made it all unravel? Well, the simple truth is the Republic's political machinery, which was designed to run a small city, was just completely overwhelmed by the job of governing a massive globe-spanning empire. The system buckled, and then it broke. By the 2nd century BC, the Republic was facing what you could only call a perfect storm. All this wealth pouring in from conquests let the rich buy up all the small farms, creating a huge class of poor, landless citizens. This, in turn, caused a military crisis because you had to own land to serve in the army, so fewer landowners meant fewer soldiers. And all the while, Rome's Italian allies, the guys doing a lot of the fighting, were demanding the citizenship rights they felt they'd earned.
Into this mess steps a general named Gaius Marius. Around 107 BC, he pushes through a completely revolutionary reform. To fix the recruitment crisis, he just gets rid of the property requirement for military service. Bam! Suddenly, the landless poor could join the army. It solved the manpower problem overnight. But in fixing that one problem, it created a much, much more dangerous one. And this is the crucial part. These new soldiers, they weren't fighting for the abstract idea of the Senate and people of Rome. No way. They were fighting for the general who promised them a paycheck, a cut of the loot, and, most important of all, a piece of land to retire on. Their loyalty, their entire future, was tied to their commander, not the state. The Republic had, without even realizing it, privatized its own armies. And you can just see the dominoes start to fall. Political violence, which was once unthinkable, becomes a tool after the murder of the reformer Tiberius Gracchus. Then, the Marian reforms create these private armies. And finally, in 88 BC, the last taboo is shattered. A general named Sulla, arguing with Marius, does the one thing you were never, ever supposed to do. He marches his own legions on Rome. The precedent was set. From that moment on, real political power in Rome wouldn't come from a vote, it would come from the tip of a sword. What followed were decades of absolutely brutal civil war. Warlords like Pompey and Julius Caesar used their loyal legions to carve up the world. And after Caesar's assassination, it was his young heir, Octavian, who finally climbed out of the wreckage to end the wars and completely reshape the Roman world. Octavian, the man we now know as Augustus, was a political genius. He knew that Romans, after all that war, hated the very idea of a king. So he never called himself one. In his own memoirs, he framed his absolute seizure of power as an act of salvation. He wasn't a dictator, you see. He was a protector, a restorer of the good old days. And on the surface, it looked like the Republic was back. The Senate still met, they still held elections, people kept their old titles, but in reality, Augustus held all the power. He was the imperator, the supreme commander of every single legion. He was Pontifex Maximus, the head of the state religion.
And he had the power of a tribune for life, meaning he could veto anything the Senate tried to do. He had built an empire, but he cleverly dressed it up in the old clothes of the Republic. And here is the great irony in all of this. The death of the Republic, this system that was a democracy in name only, actually ushered in 2 centuries of peace and prosperity like the world had never seen, a period we now call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The famous 18th century historian Edward Gibbon described the 2nd century, the time of the 5 good emperors, in those glowing terms. And for millions of people, from Britain all the way to Mesopotamia, the empire meant stability, law, trade, and a shared culture. For many, it really was a golden age. Which brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? The one historians have been fighting over for centuries? If the system Augustus built was so successful, if it led to what Gibbon called the happiest time for humanity, what went wrong? Why did it all fall apart? Now, there are a million theories: economic collapse, plagues, even lead poisoning. But let's look at probably the most famous and influential argument of all time, from Edward Gibbon himself in his massive work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon's whole perspective starts from a place of awe. He basically argued that the real miracle wasn't that Rome fell, but that it managed to last for as long as it did. For him, the fall wasn't some historical accident. No, he saw it as the natural, inevitable result of its own immoderate greatness. So, Gibbon's thesis really boils down to 2 big arguments. First, internal decay. He believed that all that peace and prosperity actually made Romans soft, that the civic virtue and military grit that built the empire just rotted away, replaced by corruption and laziness. And second, and this was his most controversial point, was the rise of Christianity. Gibbon argued that this new religion, with its focus on getting into heaven, made people less concerned about the here and now. He thought it created a passive spirit that destroyed what was left of that old Roman warrior ethos. Now, it is absolutely crucial to understand that Gibbon's theory is a product of his time, the 18th century Enlightenment. Modern historians have picked apart many of his points, saying he blamed Christianity too much and didn't focus enough on things like the economy or barbarian invasions. But his work basically set the terms for the entire debate, forcing everyone who came after to think about how a society's own values and internal strength can lead to its rise or its fall. And that leaves us with one last thought: the story of Rome's metamorphosis. From a mythical city to a world-conquering republic to a golden age empire that ultimately collapsed is so much more than just ancient history. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask, was Rome's fate a unique tragedy? Or does its story hold a timeless warning for all great powers about just how fragile even the mightiest among us can be?